Welcome back to the Metro on 1019 WDET FM. I'm Tia Graham. Now, the first Pride March was in 1970, and it was a protest march. Since then, LGBTQ plus rights and representation have increased and gotten more sophisticated. Complex characters are replacing stereotypes and caricatures. And Pride Month right now in June has largely gone mainstream. But what happens to a civil rights grassroots movement when it does get too big? And how is the Latino community included in the stories we tell about LGBTQ plus rights? Alejandra Marquez is an assistant professor of Spanish at Michigan State University, and her research focuses on gender and sexuality. Professor Marquez, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So the first Pride March was held in 1970 on the one-year anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising. What happened at the Stonewall Inn in 1969?
Right. So you had an LGBTQ community that had been on the receiving end of police violence, and that was constantly targeted because of their sexuality and gender expression. And so the Stonewall Uprising was this community standing up for themselves and, getting into an altercation with the police. And that helped start what we now think of as LGBTQ or gay liberation, excuse me.
Yeah, that's the definitive mark there. And it's been over 50 years since the first Pride March took place. And I think it's safe to say now that in most cities in the United States, not all of them, of course, we know, but in most cities, Pride celebrations have entered a mainstream, in the mainstream. How is Pride different now? Is it still a place for protest and activism like it was in the early days?
I think it has shifted throughout time. Mm-hmm. So at the beginning, of course, like you were mentioning, it started as a riot. Then it began to respond to what was happening at the time. So in the 80s, there was more consciousness about the AIDS epidemic. And then in the 90s, you start to see more of a commercialization of Pride, right? And so that kind of brings us to where we are today, which is this a larger representation, but also that it's everywhere. Companies are including it as part of their ads. A lot of them are sponsoring Pride marches. But there has definitely been there have been multiple efforts to take that back. There's movements that have their own Pride marches that seek to go against those very commercialized marches and celebrations.
And Alejandro, that is actually something we've noticed here in the city of Detroit. Robin and I had a conversation about some of the parades that we've been seeing and celebrations we've been seeing throughout the city of Detroit and Metro Detroit during Pride Month. And a lot of smaller organizations have popped up surrounding some of our larger organizations. I do want to talk about this feeling that we're hearing, or this the sense that we're feeling right now in terms of a lot of our major Pride movements have become just way too large, and they've lost touch with what the original goal was. Do you feel that's something that you're hearing as well?
Yes, I think so. I will say my area of expertise is mostly Mexico, but I think there's a lot of similarities, right? So you have a very large Pride March where certain parts of the LGBTQ population get lost, right? And so then you have separate movements that begin to address the different needs of each group. This doesn't mean that, we don't feel as part of a community, but that we have some different ideals that we're fighting for. So you definitely see that in the US. For example, I think of the New York City Dyke March, which emerged to specifically address the needs of women, lesbians, bisexual women, but also it's inclusive of trans women.
So, Professor, we think about, of course, the LGBTQ movement, and I think about Paris is Burning, the documentary that came out in 1990, and how it explores Black and Latino Harlem drag ball scene in the 1980s. We were talking just a little bit about seeing just progressions happening and different things happening. And whenever I watch that or watch clips from Paris is Burning, I often think about, there are just as many Latino queens as there were Black queens there. So can we talk about Paris is Burning for just a little bit and what it did for representation, especially when it debuted in 1990 and what it does today?
Yeah, I think something that is very interesting about that documentary is that a lot of younger generations are not as familiar with it, but we do see sort of like I won't say an adaptation because it's not, but sort of like a conversation
Yeah.
with that ballroom culture through Pose, the
Yeah.
show.
Yes.
And I think that has helped those younger generations learn more about the ballroom scene, about the pivotal role of Black and Latina trans women, and also like something that I think is very important from the ballroom scene is this concept of family, of creating
Yeah.
queer families, right?
And Professor, when we talk about the queer families and that community that was building, because oftentimes, once again, if you've seen Paris is Burning, the documentary film released in 1990, you'll see that's in different houses that were created, and the different houses had different queens and mothers who were in charge of the house, and you would have younger folks coming in who found themselves, possibly getting off of the streets or possibly leaving, worse situations. So if you could just talk about that community that was building then and how it expanded to what it is today.
Yeah, I think, and including, of course, the ballroom scene, but also I think particularly the trans community
Yeah.
saw themselves as, of course, being excluded, particularly trans women of color, right? And so you have people, I think, of course, of Sylvia Rivera, who was part of the gay liberation movement, who's associated with the Stonewall Uprising, and who co-founded with Marsha P. Johnson, the STAR, or the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, because at the time, trans was not circulating, the term trans wasn't circulating as much,
No.
to support homeless, trans youth. And so I think that culture, both ballroom culture and just the trans community, just was very important then and now, for those young people that were rejected in their communities or by their biological families. And I think that's just, it speaks to the communal sense of when we talk about the LGBTQ community, right?
Yeah. We're talking about Latino impact on LGBTQ plus movements. Our guest is Professor Alejandra Marquez, Assistant Professor of Spanish at Michigan State University. Now, Professor Marquez, I do want to talk about the changing representation that we're seeing right now. LGBTQ characters are represented and have been represented for years, of course, but now we're starting to see a pull away from this idea of one fits all type of stereotype. So when we talk about representation, you write about Mexican telenovelas in your research. How is media representation changing in Latin America?
So I think it varies by country, but I can, tell you that from, when I was growing up in the 90s, it was unthinkable to
Yeah.
see an LGBTQ character unless they were some sort of villain and it was like not very explicit, maybe just hinted at. And that has changed. And so in 2010, in the 90s, you started having competing television networks. And so newer television networks were trying to include content that was a little bit more edgy. And so from there, you fast forward to 2010, you had a very famous television show slash telenovela called Las Aparicio that dealt specifically with women and women's sexuality, but it also included a very interesting exploration of lesbian characters, bisexual characters. It also talked about things like polyamory, and that sort of, for me, really marked a difference. And then it was interesting to see because that was 2010, and then you had the main television network, and there were these rumors that the actors from that show were like blacklisted from that network because they had done this work that went against, like what was considered to be good Mexican family values. But then now you have telenovelas that are about queer couples, and so I think it's part, you know, having to do with the social change, but also it is networks responding to a market, right? And understanding that it's going to sell.
And when you talk about traditional values within, Mexican families and what that idea is, how are traditional gender roles changing within Mexico?
So I think when we think about Mexico, when we think about Latin America, there's always this idea of like, yeah, Mexican men are like very macho and women are very passive. But I think that's just a stereotype. Of course, this varies depending on social class, on race, on, where you live. Like, geography has a lot to do with it, whether you're in a more urban space. So I think there's a lot of things that influence it. Of course, religion is also a big part of it. But I think, especially in the 80s, the 90s, when you start to see women going out and working, I think that has really helped change the perception of, like a family where like the father works and the mother stays at home. I think just like the economy and like the social changes have been linked with that, right? Like just that independence that we see from women. So I think it's slowly changing, and in more places than others, of course. Like for example, Mexico City is very, very progressive. So you do have a very wide variety of types of families and what families even look like.
And honestly, I had a friend I was talking to who was from Mexico and talked about Mexico City being this diverse, really, really, culturally diverse space to live in and to be in when you do visit. But I do want to talk about the cultural changes that you're seeing happening, or through your research, you saw happening first within Latin America in general. What countries did you start to see some of those changes happening first, especially when we're talking about gender and sexuality?
So I think in Latin America, Argentina has been a pioneer, especially when it comes to rights. So, and this was, I want to say, like mid 2000s, mid 2000 to 2010, when they started passing laws for gender identity documents to match, people's gender and not the assigned gender at birth. And also there were laws that were passed that required for there to be a quota of trans people working government jobs. So that opened up new possibilities, for people that had been marginalized, that did not have access to these types of jobs, did not have access to education. So that was very I think that was very important in setting a precedent for Latin America. Now that has, with this new precedent that's there's been attempts to roll that back. So I will say that. But I think Argentina has been a pioneer in that. And then you see, for example, Mexico, legalized same-sex marriage in 2015, I believe. And then you saw changes because you had to change it in the state civil code. And so as of 2023, every state, everybody should have access to same-sex marriage.
And do you see parallels with the U.S.? Because I'm thinking about you talking about, Argentina and Mexico, and seeing some of these countries, Latin American countries, starting to change and move forward with their rights, especially talking about LGBTQ plus individuals. But what parallels do you see with the U.S., and how do you see that positively or just impacting the U.S. in general?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Like right now we have Claudia Sheinbaum, who's the first woman president, and from the beginning, her administration has been very openly, pushing for women's rights and for visibility of women, but also openly supportive of LGBTQ people and communities. So I think it's been like a slow progression, but it's we're there in a way. And I think with Latin America, you always see, it's kind of like a pendulum, right? Which a lot of people hate the metaphor, but you see a lot of big shifts. Like, for example, Brazil, you had Lula, who was like a very progressive president. Then you had Bolsonaro. Now you're back to Lula. So I think you have a lot of fluctuation in a lot of these countries, which I think is similar to what we're seeing now in the States, right? Like this shift in its approach to LGBTQ communities.
And just switching gears here just a little bit, but you research gender and sexuality in Latin America and the Caribbean, and your research is in writing as well. I want to talk about the language that we use specifically with Latino LGBTQ plus in the community. In recent years, we've been seeing the term Latinx more and more. How does Latinx differ from Latino or Latina?
Yeah, so Latinx comes from these efforts to make language gender neutral, and it's an interesting term because there's been a lot of pushback but there's also been a lot of people that are embracing it, right? And even like, I think the term Latino or Latinx is interesting because it is a very US centric concept, right? So most people in Latin America do not even think of themselves as Latino. You know, like I had a professor, and I say this now too, like I didn't know I was Latina until I moved to the US, because this is just, yeah, I think in Latin America we think more in terms of nationality. But Latinx, you know, is just born out of that need to name people that do not see themselves in one gender or the other, because, you know, Latino, Latina, coming from Spanish is a very gendered language, right? So you have like either, you know, masculine or feminine. So I think that just shows also the diversity within, you know, pockets of the LGBTQ community, and how you see the intersection of being Latino, being Latina, or Latinx, but also being part of the LGBT community, or not feeling like you fit one specific gender.
And just sticking on that right now, because I'm thinking just about, once again, everything that's happening within the United States, rollbacks to possible rights as well here for the LGBTQ plus community. We've seen it in just different variations. And you're talking about that intersection there. And I just think about everything you just said, the difference between Latino, Latina, Latinx, and not even considering, you know, or thinking of yourself that way. So when we talk about just the American Latino and being in that intersection right now, you know, what are you hearing in terms of how they're feeling, how people are feeling right now?
Well, I think right now there's a lot of confusion, a lot of chaos, and a lot of fear, right, with the targeting of the Latino community, and specifically immigrants, but also racial profiling. And so I do think that another aspect of the LGBTQ movement is supporting, you know, Latinx immigrants. Yeah. For example, I think of Familia Trans Queer Liberation Movement, which is a movement, a grassroots organization. I believe they're LA based, and they fight for immigrants, you know, particularly undocumented and trans individuals. You know, they push against deportation and detention. So I think it's it's a great question, because it makes us think about, once again, like those intersections, right? Like and the contact between, yes, like US Latinos, but also, you know, the connection that many US Latinos or Latinx people have with immigrants, right? And immigration in general.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Thank you so much for explaining that. Professor Alejandra Marquez is an assistant professor of Spanish at Michigan State University. Her research focuses on gender and sexuality. I want to say thank you so much for joining us on the Metro and really explaining to us what's going on, but the history now and the future of LGBTQ plus rights and community for Latinos.
Thank you so much.
Coming up, Jessie Reyez has penned hits for the greats. Now she's writing her own legacy with her first book of poetry and a new album. She'll speak with us next. You all stay right there. This is The Metro.